Well, Antonio de Lecea was appointed the Principal Advisor for Economics and Financial Affairs at the European Union Delegation to the United States in 2009. Prior to joining the delegation, Dr. de Lecea served as Director for International Affairs in the European Commission's Directorate General for Economic and Financial Affairs, steering analytical and policy support for the Commission's economic relations with non-EU countries and multilateral and regional economic institutions, including the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the G20, the G7 and G8, and the OECD. Prior to that, from 1999 to 2004, he was economic advisor to then European Commission President Romano Prodi. De Lecea launched his career at the European Commission in 1986, holding various management positions in the European Union budget and control areas, as well as in economics and finance. Before joining the European Commission, he served in the private office of the Spanish Secretary of State for Finance in Madrid, as well as in academia. His published articles are on public finance and the European economy. He's an associate professor of applied economics in the Basque Country University in Bilbao, Spain, a position he now holds on special leave. He received a Bachelor of Science in Economics from Barcelona Autonomous University and a PhD in Quantitative Economics from the Catholic University of Louvain. His topic today, the Euro crisis and beyond. What does it mean for the United States? Please join me in welcoming Dr. Antonio de Lecea.
Thank you for the very nice introduction, and it's a pleasure to be with you today to address a topic that is certainly one that takes much of our time, both in Washington and even more so in Brussels and in other capitals. Before I go on, may I continue the poll or the sounding that we started? How many of you are taking a major or a minor in economics? Yes? Okay, thanks. So just to figure out what you know and what you may know less. Anyhow, it doesn't take a course in economics. You just open the press every day, and you have a number of articles on what's going on or in Europe, and when reading them and when participating at debates, we have the impression that there is only part of the world that is represented in all those analyses or in those comments, and this is why we try and present our views so as to do what we think is complementing this picture, and to help understand some of the issues where the EU does or does not what is expected, and to bring more understanding into both the present, the past, the present, and the future of what the EU and the Euro area sovereign crisis will turn out to be. And in particular, there are two main issues that are quite recurrently in these type of articles or comments or papers by commentators. The first one is the euro will break up. There is no way. It's rather when than if. There is a little bit less of that now, but it's been the leitmotif for quite some time. The second point or the second big area where I think that I think it deserves some more analysis or some more elements is the issue. Well, Europe, the European Union, belongs to the past. Economically, you are taking the wrong decisions, and here very often we listen about austerity versus growth. Second, not only economically but also politically. You don't deliver. You don't have the capacity to take decisions, and even more so, you are losing support. So the policies that you are proposing sooner or later will lose the support of your citizens. So the outcome is quite dark. So, well, what I hope I will persuade you about is that these two main statements are at least partly wrong, and I'll go through them in the course of this talk. So first, why we believe that the prospect that the euro will break up will not prevail. Well, first, but because all these analyses or comments are too often done on the basis of purely economic grounds. It's a kind of textbook conclusion by looking at the situation and the construct that has been made in Europe. Let me be more specific. If you look at your Economics 101 or 102 or 201, and the reaction, the policy reaction to a shock, be it inflation or a loss of competitiveness, well, the formula or the recommendations that you find in the textbooks are very clear. You devalue, then you regain competitiveness, and that's it. Sooner or later, you will get there. Well, this fails to. This misses one important point, which is in Europe, it fails to see the context of this economic and monetary union. In other words, it fails to realize that the EU may not be an optimal currency area, if there is any optimal currency area, but that political considerations weighed as much as economic ones when creating this construct, and even more the European Union. And for that, I was recalling recently, I was reacting to one of these statements by saying, well, look back 50 years and why the countries joined the European Union. It was to make war something of the past. So after Second World War, the countries that had been fighting together or against each other decided, enough is enough, and let's pool the resources that are necessary for war, this coal and steel, so that by controlling each other's production, we will be setting some constraints, and we will be preventing ourselves from engaging in self-destructive behaviors as we have had in the past. So it was a kind of anchor for peace that led the first founders, the first countries that joined the then economic community to come together. Then, if you go even farther in time, you look at, for instance, why Spain or Greece joined the European Union or the community at the time. Again, it was to put an end to a chapter of their history that was dominated by the lack of democracy, by dictatorship. So for both Greece and Spain, and to some extent Portugal, it was anchoring the country in democracy, and Europe was democracy, democratic values. So that was the main motivation. There was, of course, an economic motivation, but the main one was political. Not to speak about the countries that joined the EU most recently, or a few years ago, the countries of the former Soviet Union. For them, it was the same thing. It was making sure that they would now belong to the Western values, to Western Europe, rather than to the former constructs that were so painful for them. So there was much more than pure economics. And even if you go to the Economic and Monetary Union, so to sharing the euro, there again, I mean, the effort that countries made in satisfying the conditions for joining the euro, and some may have dodged or made up the figures in order to get in, but that's another story. I mean, the reason was again to anchor themselves into behaviors or policy behaviors that put an end to long histories of high inflation, skyrocketing deficits. So it was again a decision to constrain themselves in order not to engage in behaviors that had proved to be self-destructive. Besides the fact of being at the table of when making decisions that in one way or another they would have an impact on them. So they would be affected in any case, so they'd rather be at the table and have some influence than just be outside and just suffer the consequences without any way of influencing them. So these were the considerations. So now put it into reverse. So the countries that leave the euro area will lose that anchor of stability, that anchor of constraining themselves not to run policies that are inflationary or that lead to very high deficits, or that in any case will not lead them to the growth that they are aiming at. And even more so if we think about leaving the Union. Well, think of one country leaving the Union. Well, first of all, it's a big shock to the population, because it was a failed attempt to be anchored, so they are disanchored from the Western values. It will probably not be war anymore, but they are not necessarily hedged against populist movements, and even some denting of democracy. And we have cases in our current member states where some parties went too far and proposed measures that were not necessarily aligned with the values of democracy or rule of law that are basic to belonging to the Union. So leaving the Economic and Monetary Union, or even more so leaving the EU, means losing those anchors and be left against to themselves, and a high probability of drifting away and not solving the problems that they are facing now. So this is, I mean, that leads me to conclude that many of these analyses miss this point, the political aspect that is very important, has been very important in the past, and that is still very, very much in the minds of the voters in European countries, and particularly in those that are now in heavy distress. So the second point is, well, Europe and the EU, does it work? So is it something of the past, and is it doomed to decline and eventually to irrelevance? Well, and there, let me remind you of a recent paper, a recent report by the World Bank called the Golden Growth Report, that analyzes the European growth model in the last 50 years. Well, the results of this report are that over the last 50 years, the European Union has had impressive accomplishments as regards economic growth. And moreover, it has been what they call a convergence machine. That is, it took poor countries and brought them into high, medium or high level income ones. Moreover, it is not very well known when making those statements about the future or the capacity of the European model to deliver. For instance, job growth between 1995 and 2009, so over 15 years, growth rates in the EU were higher than in the US on average. That's not something that comes out in many of these analyses. Moreover, the new member states, so as I said, it was a convergence machine. So the productivity increases that the newly acceded members achieved really outstripped those in East Asia and Latin America. So the system managed to bring those countries and to raise them to the levels of income and prosperity that were unheard of in other contexts. And they did that by exporting. They exported their growth rates, the export growth rates were higher even than those of the BRICS, the emerging countries, the Brazils and the Russias and the Indias and the Chinas. So the Europe's economic model worked very well for a number of years until the crisis. And now you will tell me, yes, fine, this was before the crisis, but something has changed since. And I will argue that indeed this is the case, that the system calls for some repair, but that the system is still able to provide this way of coping with the globalization in a much more effective and cohesive way than in other attempts in other parts of the world. So what happened? I mean, what was wrong with the model? What was wrong was that in spite of all those achievements, the EU and the Euro area had managed to constrain the countries to make many of the blunders of the past, but not completely. In other words, the EU and the Euro area and the Euro were a catalyst for good policies, but were not the substitute for good policies. Which means that there were problems or imbalances brewing under the surface, while all these achievements were were obtained. And what were those imbalances or those problems that didn't appear on the surface? Well, one again, it's partly a problem of policies, but it's also partly an issue that is again not often referred to, which is that the markets didn't work necessarily well either during that period. Let me be more specific. When countries joined the Economic and Monetary Union, the markets treated them all, practically all in the same way. So a government in Greece or in Spain or in Portugal could obtain similar interest rates as the German government or the Dutch government, and in very abundant quantities. So the markets were very liquid. There was plenty of money around, and at very low prices. This was clearly an opportunity, but an opportunity that was missed. It was missed because what could have been ideal, which would have been to put that money to good use and invest borrow money and invest in productive activities didn't turn out to be so. The money was borrowed, indeed, and was borrowed in large quantities. And one of the reasons why it was borrowed in large quantities was because the system worked. We had tried to integrate the financial markets in Europe, and we succeeded to a large extent, which meant that a country or a bank in Spain could borrow very easily from other European countries. The problem was that it was borrowing too much. And it was borrowing too much and putting that, if it were many Spanish banks were borrowing from other European banks or from the international markets and lending that money for mortgages where prices were skyrocketing. And I think you know something about that in this country. And at some point, as it happened in this country, prices no longer kept on rising, and the bubble burst. Therefore, those banks that had been borrowing, especially, and I will come back to that, after the Lehman collapse, found that they didn't have any longer access to refinancing their loans or their borrowings. So that was the first problem, and I used to present this as a perfect storm. So there were several problems, several vulnerabilities that had been brewing over time, and that each of them by itself was not necessarily a problem. They had been, several of them had been identified, but by themselves they would not wreck the boat. But all of them together did end up in a situation that no one, to be fair, had anticipated. And as I said, this perfect storm was composed of four main ones. The first one was the financial that I just mentioned. The second one was fiscal. So again, in a context where governments can finance their deficits very easily, well, why not? Governments go to elections and they try to gain votes, and with programs that may be attractive and that even in the short term are affordable, but without realizing that they are not sustainable in time. But once more, if you can borrow at 2%, and you are growing at 3 or 4%, so the economy is growing at 3 or 4%, well, you figure out, I would be able to repay that without any problem. So, but the assumptions were not necessarily right. So this led to overborrowing again also by the public sector. So it was not only the private sector, but also the public sector in some countries that did that. The third storm was the one of competitiveness. Again, especially in those countries where you saw the real estate booming, the real estate created growth, created incomes, and on the one hand, young people at schools saw the demand for jobs, and they left school or they didn't go and train themselves further. They got very good wages in the real estate sector and all what is around the real estate sector. On the other hand, as I said, rather than using the cheap money for improving the productive capacity or improving the technology and so on, too much of that money was put into the real estate and into consumption. So credit for consumption. So once more, when the economy burst, when the bubble burst, all that collapsed. And the fourth storm was one of governance. And here I used to represent the situation in the following way. When we created the Economic and Monetary Union, at the time of agreeing on the monetary union, there were already these debates on whether you need a more political union before you turn into a single currency, or whether the more political union will come with a single currency. So it was an issue of sequencing. And as usual in the construction of the European Union and in many other cases, if you wait until all the conditions are met, you may not get there ever. So, and the whole history of the European Union has been one of making incremental steps and showing or proving ourselves that it is in the interest of everyone to pull some sovereignty in order to gain more collective sovereignty, or in other cases that it is in the interest of all to work together and to forgo some sovereignty in order to solve problems that are common to us and that none of us can solve by ourselves, or at least not in the same way, or as well. So, as I said, all those discussions were there, so it was nothing new. But there was the decision to have the single currency, and I said it was like moving into an unfinished house. We knew that the house was unfinished. We knew that for some time we would be uncomfortable, but over time we would finish the house. What happened? That soon after we moved in, the house was too small. We had to accommodate new members. We passed from 15 members to 27 in the mid 2000s. So the priorities had to change, and priority had to be given to enlarge the house rather to complete it. And in this process, we neglected some important features like maybe fire systems. So a fire came, and we had to still live in the house, and to fight the fire, and to buy a hose to fight the fire, and to decide how long the hose had to be, whether it had to reach the first floor or the second floor or the third floor, and how we were going to pay for that hose. So what would be the arrangements? So that's what has been happening since the crisis started, that we had to fight, and we've had to cope with the everyday life, plus fighting the fire, plus completing the house. And this explains to some extent the time that it has taken to come to the solutions. So we had to build, to create new instruments that what we didn't have, and to do that under crisis conditions. And moreover, these crisis conditions in a context where there was some break of confidence, of trust amongst some of the members. I mentioned earlier that at least one country kind of rigged the books and presented a situation that was not accurate. So that created some anxiety and some acrimony with other governments that had been much more compliant. At the same time, the reaction vis-à-vis the countries in distress was, okay, fine, we may assist you. We will take the necessary steps to ensure the stability of the system, but you need to do your homework. And the reaction from many sectors in those countries was, well, okay, we are ready to take that pain, but let's not forget that the blame is not only or not completely on us, but there may be some on your side as well, on your court, and we are ready to take the pain, provided that at the end of that there is some solidarity. In other words, we will take the sufferance, but we want to make sure that you are going to respond to that. And on the other side, you find those that said, well, wait a minute, you have been receiving a significant amount of funding that in some way, to oversimplify, you have squandered. So we want to make sure that things are going to change now. So we are ready to provide you solidarity, but we want to see responsibility. And the negotiation was how much, I mean, how far they had to go on each side. Because we saw, for instance, in the case of Greece, that the government was very bold in recognizing the errors of the past, and they were very bold in passing decisions at the government level, and they went even farther to pass the legislation in Parliament. But after that, there was enough resistance in the administration, or in some cases, the capacity of the administration to actually implement those decisions was not very high, which meant that at the end of, of this process of enacting the legislation was not implemented. So on the other side, they saw that and said, well, fine, we are not going to put more money on the table until we are sure that this works. And this was a process of rebuilding confidence that took quite some time. And this explains some of this anxiety and some of these remarks in the press or elsewhere that we were always behind the curve and that the union didn't have the capacity to deliver. But on top of that, some governments were ready to take those measures, but they could not forget, and some, to be honest, were too much caught by their own domestic politics. They had in mind this or that regional election where their coalition was shaky or was vulnerable, or that national election, and they wanted to. They didn't want to be out of sync with the voters when agreeing to this type of decision. That again, well, we are 27 democratic countries, each with its own political cycle, and that had to be factored into the negotiations. So that once more explains why it took some more time than many of us would have liked, but we saw that in the end, leaders faced the responsibility and took the decisions that created the new instrument. So gradually completed the House, even under those conditions of extreme hardship and the fire that broke up again when we thought that had been more or less put off, and where we had to go on with other aspects of the crisis. So just to give you some kind of insider or insight into why all this timing that markets didn't necessarily understand. Markets have a much shorter term in their decisions, and were often anxious about the speed or the low speed of decisions at the political level. So this is how we went to address these 4 points, these 4 storms. So the reaction of the EU was, well, we are now aware of what went wrong, and we need to act on those 4 fronts simultaneously. So on the financial side, well, those banks that, as I said, lent too much money for real estate, and therefore when the real estate market went down, they were caught with significant loans that were very likely to be bad loans, and that meant that they had to provision those loans and to recapitalize to make sure that the banks remain solvent. So some of them went to the markets, but this was not enough. Then there was a stress test exercise by the European Banking Authority to assess for the main banks who was actually solvent and who was not. And as a consequence of these stress tests, it was decided that banks should come with plans to recapitalize themselves and to reach levels of solvency that were considered to be, comfortable enough so as to appease the markets and to regain the access of those banks to the financial markets. So that was one point. And for those where this was not possible, so those banks that didn't manage to get the sufficient financing in the private sector, well, we decided that they should go to the public sector, so the public sector would inject the money. And if this money and if the country did not manage to borrow enough money to inject it into the banks, then there should be some kind of either the restructuring of the banks, or the country could turn to the European backstop facilities in order to get the financing that would enable them to put the financial sector in order. And this is what, for instance, if we look at Spain, which is currently in the press, the reaction of the government was, yes, we see, they assess where the problem was. The problem was not with the big banks. The problem was not so much with the medium-sized banks. The problem was with the savings banks. That, like savings and loans here, were too much intertwined with local and regional authorities. So the risk management methods were not necessarily very sound, and they were too influenced by political considerations. So the reaction of the government was, well, let's try to sever the links between these savings and loans association or savings banks and the local authorities that have been in some way distorting the decisions, and let's force them to merge so as to break this regional or geographical link. And it went relatively well. So out of 45 savings banks, the initial round merged them into 11. But this worked for some time, but proved not to be necessarily a success, because some of those banks did merge in a proper way, so as to compensate and to be able to find for the sound ones to assist those that might be less sound, but others, out of a few bad banks, they created a bigger bad bank. So the problem was not solved. And so this is, and particularly that happened with a big savings bank that was by chance based in Madrid. And this is what the government has done now. So it has persuaded the president of that bank, which, by the way, was the former managing director of the IMF and the former minister of finance. And they have persuaded him to resign, and they have now nationalized the bank so as to put it on a much more solid basis. So that was the first approach. So to make sure that the banking sector was stable again, and so as to regain confidence. Also because the banking sector had been buying a lot of sovereign debt, and at some point there was a kind of vicious circle between the banking sector in the country and the government debt. So the banking sector that had bought too much of a debt that was now found slightly shaky. So those banks were no longer considered solvent, and again the efforts by the government to refinance those banks meant that they had to borrow more money, but borrow more money when the government themselves were not in good conditions to borrow more money. So that created a vicious circle that had to be broken. So and the first step was to make sure that that banking sector was okay. So the second one was to put the house in order in the fiscal sector. So to make sure that the public finances were in order. And this came the problem or the issue of austerity versus growth. So on the one hand is the dilemma. Okay, if you have been living above your means for some time, I mean, let's face it, there is no other way than to tighten your belt. But if you tighten it too much, then you may end up in this spiral of recession that doesn't enable you to get enough revenue. So your deficit keeps on either increasing, or at least it doesn't stabilize. So in that case, you need to find the right balance. And from the beginning, we insisted that fiscal adjustment had to come hand in hand with policies to promote growth. Because if you want to repay your debt, you need growth, you need income. And that was for instance, what Greece didn't do. Greece took bold steps in cutting the deficit, but did not take the same bold steps in making sure that the economy was made more flexible, and that the distortions to competition and to the growth initiatives were put in place. Therefore, they took one of the pills, but not the second one, and the disease is still there. So this is why the structural reforms must be accelerated so that the impact on growth of the austerity measures is at some point compensated or offset by the increasing growth that will come from unlocking the growth potential that these countries have. And the final one was, as I said, if the house was not complete, if the governance was not, there were aspects of the governance architecture that were not in place, we had to create them. This is why we created the backstop mechanism, so the kind of firewall that enabled the 17 to assist a country that could be in distress. That also consisted, for instance, of making sure that the banks that were operating cross-border were subject to supervision that was also cross-border, that was not only by one national supervisor that had created, again, some distortion. So we built some of the parts of the unfinished house that had proved unnecessary. So this is what we have been doing, but we know that this has not get out of the woods yet, so that this will have to actually yield more confidence, but that this is not the end of the road. But we are also convinced that what we have done was the prerequisite for any further action. In other words, the agreement on fiscal austerity, as I said, we know that it's not an end in itself, but it was a precondition to reestablish that trust amongst all countries, and particularly to make sure that, to reassure those that were asked to put more money on the table, that this money will not go down the drain. And this has taken time, but this is, to the extent that the attention has been focused on the austerity only, this misses the point that this is a step towards something else. What is this something else? And this is something where we already adventure ourselves into the future. So something else may be more integration of the banking sector throughout Europe, and more integration as we integrate the banking sector. We should also integrate even further the authorities that supervise those banks. So to make sure that there will be a European approach to the integrated banking sector. And beyond that, we have seen that there is the need to reward those countries that are indeed taking bold measures, to reward them in the sense of providing them more solidarity, as I said earlier. So we have gone some way, but there is probably more to go. But once more, this will not come, or the citizens in those countries will not agree to more solidarity until they are sure that this money will not be wasted. So these will be measures that we hope we will see in the next few months, maybe even in the next few weeks, at least the announcement of the readiness to engage in this type of new initiatives. So to sum up, the euro area is there to stay. No country has incentives to pull out from the euro area. This will also be made possible by this gradual approach of by building trust to make sure that we can go one step further into this political union that was considered as necessary at the beginning, but that the drawbacks of not engaging in that at an early stage were not that clear. But the crisis has shown that the interrelations between the European economies and between the European countries is much deeper than it was considered initially. So we will go further towards integration, and this will take time. And in the short run, the process will not be easy. I mean, we are now in recession, in a mild recession, but in some countries it's a serious recession, and those countries will take some more time until the growth that will be unleashed by the reforms will offset the negative impact of the necessary adjustment in public finances. And as I said, by building trust, by rebuilding trust and going further, we will be able to converge and to come out of the crisis stronger and more determined towards completing the house than we were certainly at the beginning. So I will stop there, and I would be more than happy to engage in debate with yourselves.
For those who'd like to ask a few questions, we'll take a few minutes. Again, just raise your hand, we'll bring the microphone to you, and then tell us your name and what you're studying and where you're from.
Hi, my question concerns the recent elections in Europe, particularly in France. Sarkozy's been replaced by Hollande, and there's been some worries, some projected worries that he will cancel the French austerity measures. And so my question was, do you have any more insight on this, on his strategy, and how will this affect the relationship that France has with other pro-austerity member states such as Italy and Germany, and among other EU nations?
Well, it's probably too early to know what will be the impact, and I don't have a lot of deep insider knowledge on that. But looking at some of the more recent statements of Mr. Hollande, it seems that what he has in mind is not necessarily just to revamp the agreement on austerity that was signed by 25 members already in March. What he's pushing for is to complement this with a bolder and a deeper commitment to regain growth and to take the appropriate measures in this respect. And once again, we all agree on that, and all countries agree on in having more growth. The point is how to get there. And I mean, again, to be frank, no one has the crystal ball and has the silver bullet to get that growth. So it's a matter of appreciation of how far you can go, and more importantly, how much extra money you can put into that. And there is the consensus that it's not by boosting expenditure that you will get to growth, that there are other ways that are more effective. And even there are clear examples where just more stimulus didn't lead to growth when the conditions were not met. And Spain is one of those cases. I mean, the previous government, when the crisis came, I mean, dumped huge amounts of public money into the economy, and that didn't work. So it's the expenditure approach to growth is not the right solution. So we must find other ways, and using access to credit, or using the public monies to complement the private sector, so as to give access to give firms access to credit. That may be one way to ensure that the single market is completed, so that there are more possibilities for businesses across the union to put to a better use, or to use in a more adequate way to the situation, the EU transfers that already exist, and maybe some other ideas can be put in place, but it will not be the kind of money dropped from a helicopter that will create the growth that we need. So, and this is where the discussion may be now. So, as I said, it's not that Germany or other countries don't agree with the need for growth. The issue is what common measures can be taken in order to get there, and this is where the discussion will be there. And there has been an informal meeting, an extraordinary meeting of the heads of state and government convened for later this month in order to pave the ground, so that in June they can agree on this growth initiative that will boost overall growth. Third row.
Hi. Earlier in your remarks, you were talking about the money lending in Europe in the beginning, when all the countries were kind of set equal and they could borrow money pretty much to a better condition than they used to. And it sounds to me a little bit like a kid in a candy store. And now we have the issue you explained later on, that some things have to be measured differently, and that the risk has to be assessed differently. And I'm wondering, now that you're making changes, it seems like that the general public in Europe is not very friendly towards these changes, because they're used to what they're doing right now, that their spending and their level of wealth and luxury. And it seems to me that there is an effect that people seem to be voting more radical again. Like Greece seems to be going left, radical left. France kind of went socialist. And I'm wondering how you intend to educate the public maybe a little bit more, so that they can make some wiser decisions, and maybe give the government some room to make the corrections that are needed.
Right. I mean, the way you put it, the kid in the candy store, is certainly one way of representing the situation. Yes. Now, when you get used to to a better standard of living, well, no one is happy to go back to a more sustainable standards. But if you look at countries at recent elections, not the most recent, but look at the elections in Portugal, the elections in Spain, or even to some extent in Greece or Ireland. People realize that the situation is serious, and they are ready to take measures that are hard. But in many cases, what they ask in exchange is that the burden is distributed in a fair way, so that those that contributed most to the mess cannot just get away without paying their fair share. And this is why one of the priorities of the Italian government, the Prime Minister Monti and President Napolitano, was to make sure that that the less well-to-do were treated in a way that was that didn't make their life harder, or that they were taking into due consideration. So now, you mentioned Greece going to left. Well, Greece has gone to the left and to the right, and that's in some way a good thing and a bad thing. The good thing is that democracy works in some way, because the two main parties, the Nea Democracia, so the, let's say, right of the center, and the Socialist Party, call it left of the center, were those parties that had run the country for 30 years or more. And I mean, during which the situation that that led to the mismanagement of the country, to put it in some way, was done by them. So the good side of it is that the population reacted, and votes went away from those two parties to other parties. Now, the bad side of it is that they went to parties that were, because of the political spectrum, were parties that were in both on the kind of extreme left or the populist left and the populist right, and this doesn't help. So, and to some extent, the punishment for to those parties that were perceived as being part of the problem or having contributed to the mess was mixed with the anxiety or the acrimony towards the measures that resulted from this situation, and measures that were hard and that not always were perceived as being fair. So that's a combination of let's say, the good democratic reaction, so the health of the democratic system, with the problems that that a spectrum of parties that is not wide enough, or that is not that does not allow for parties that are not necessarily populist, but that are not those that were that meant to be punished. And I would adventure in saying that in the case of France, there is some of that. So there was some anxiety with the measures, with the austerity measures, but from what we read in the press, part of the vote was also a vote against the incumbent president. So that again, democracy is at work, but it may take some time until the various political actors realize that one thing is what you can dream, and the other is what you can do. And this is where we have all confidence that the wisdom of the populations and of the politicians will prevail. But having said that, we are also concerned by the situation in I mean, for instance, in Greece, we would like to have more assurance that I mean, all political actors behave in a way that is responsible. In the back.
Do you have a question?
Yes.
Okay.
I was pointed back there, but I do get a chance to talk after all. Hello, my name is Brian Paul. I'm studying political science at BYU. What has Britain's reaction and relationship been like with the European Union as they have, as you say, they have tried to enact these financial and fiscal reforms? And has that been a cause for angst or cause for just discomfort politically, economically, for them or for the EU in general?
In Britain, you mentioned.
Yes.
Am I next?
Well, not really. I mean, they were another case where the public expenditure had gone out of way, and they also had much of the revenue was based, as was the case in other countries, was based on tax bases that were very much correlated with the cycle. In other words, there was much revenue from financial transactions. When the financial markets collapsed, much of that revenue disappeared. So when your expenditure keeps on rising and your revenue no longer does so, then you need to take action. And the government decided that they wanted to make the public sector much leaner and engage in the serious fiscal adjustment and consolidation. Now, this is along the lines of the policies discussed amongst the 27, and it's in accordance with the fiscal framework, fiscal policy framework that the EU has agreed. So in this respect, there is no misunderstanding or tension between the British government and the rest of the member states. The tension came to the surface at the moment where this solemn commitment on fiscal austerity was agreed, where there was the need, or it was easier if it was done, if it was agreed by the 27. And the British government thought that since they had, the others to some extent needed the UK's assent for this pact to take place, then they could ask for something in exchange. And this something in exchange was that the UK would not necessarily abide or would opt out of some of the regulations concerning the integration of the financial markets. So the others did not agree, could not agree, because what we have been trying to do is to integrate the financial markets rather than to backtrack. So the request by the UK government was not acceptable to the others, and that led to the outcome that the agreement or the pact amongst the member states was done at 25 rather than 27, with the UK excluding itself. So this that was based on the domestic politics and domestic political considerations of the UK government, has been tried to minimize or to reduce the steam and the relevance at the EU level, in the sense that it's legitimate for a country not to want to adhere to new measures that go beyond the normal the previous agreements, but that you cannot object to the others going further if, especially as has been the case, the experience showed that it was necessary. And there has been sometimes misunderstanding on whether this could lead to some more split within the EU between not only the euro area countries and the non-euro area countries, but now on top of that is the 25. So it's the euro area, so the 17, one inner circle, and the 25 is the second circle, so those that adhere to this austerity pact, and then the third circle, which is the 27. And it's true, I mean, the situation is more complex now, but from the EU institutions and from the rest of the member states, there is the determination that, I mean, to try and minimize the differences. And moreover, that there was the agreement that this treaty that is now signed by the 25 and that hopefully will be ratified by parliaments or by Ireland through a referendum, that once it is agreed, in due time, so in 5 years, it will become part of the 27 agreements, even with the opt-out of the UK if they still want. But that this ad hoc legislation that has been agreed now will become mainstream as in 5 years' time. So that, again, well, we recognize the specificity of the situation now, but that we, again, try to apply what we have been applying all the time, which is some may lead the way, the others may take longer to get there, but we still go together for as much and as long as we can. Thank you.